Apache warriors employed unique military tactics that no one had used before them. They had no factories, no generals, and no maps. Their strength lay elsewhere. They turned nature itself into their main weapon, forcing the cavalry to fight not against people, but against the desert itself. Watch the video to the end, and you will learn why the most experienced general in the U.S. Army called the Apaches tigers of the human race, and what one secret made them virtually
Evasion
elusive.
is not a sign of weakness. It is a mark of intelligence.
First, let me tell you a secret that changes everything. It is important to understand that the Apaches fought completely differently from the soldiers in blue uniforms. They did not aim to conquer territory, hold cities, or destroy the enemy army in one big battle. Their war was a war for survival, resources, and honor. There was an independent combat unit, making decisions on the fly. There was no strict hierarchy or orders that could not be challenged. Leadership was based on respect, experience, and luck, not rank. The main goal of any military campaign or raid was not to defeat the enemy, but to capture loot, horses, weapons, provisions. All of this was necessary for the tribe's survival. Therefore, the ideal raid was quick, sudden, and with minimal losses. A warrior's glory was measured not by the number of enemies defeated, but by his cunning, endurance, and ability to provide for his family. A successful raid carried out without losses was valued much higher than a bloody but meaningless battle. It was this philosophy that gave rise to their unique tactics. They did not consider retreat or evasion from battle to be cowardice. On the contrary, it was considered foolish to engage in open combat with a stronger opponent. The main thing was to complete the task and return home alive. This logic was completely incomprehensible to American officers, who had been raised in the European military tradition. They sought a decisive battle, while the Apaches offered them a game of cat and mouse across a vast territory. And in this game, they were the ones who set the rules. Do you think this tactic of warfare can be considered more honest than open combat between armies? Share your opinion in the comments. Want to know the main secret of the Apache warriors? The territory where the Apache Wars took place was one of the harshest places on the planet. The deserts of Arizona and New Mexico, the Rocky Mountains of the Sierra Madre. It was a world of steep canyons, arid plateaus, and scorching sun. For the cavalry, it was hell, but for the Apaches, it was home and a fortress. They knew this land like the back of their hand. Every hidden spring, every secret trail, every cave suitable for shelter was known to them. They could move through terrain that was considered completely impassable for white men. Cavalry units were tied to water and fodder for their horses. They moved along valleys and predictable routes. The Apaches, on the other hand, crossed mountain ranges and waterless deserts, appearing where they were least expected. Rocky soil and stony placers were their best allies. Such surfaces left virtually no traces, making pursuit extremely difficult. They literally disappeared among the rocks, leaving the cavalry completely baffled. The climate was also on their side. The daytime heat exhausted the soldiers and their horses, and the nighttime cold forced them to wrap themselves in blankets by the fires, revealing their location. The Apaches, on the other hand, were perfectly adapted to such temperature changes. They used the terrain to set up ambushes and traps. Narrow canyons, passes, rocky gorges. All of these became ideal locations for surprise attacks. The cavalrymen, trapped in a confined space, became easy targets. Their knowledge of the terrain allowed them to accurately calculate the timing and speed of the enemy's movements. They could predict where a unit would stop for the night and where it would look for water. This gave them the opportunity to always be one step ahead. They perceived the landscape not as an obstacle, but as a set of tools for waging war. Every mountain was an observation point, every crevice a shelter, every canyon a potential trap. They did not fight on the ground, but with the ground. For American soldiers, this terrain was hostile and unfamiliar. They lost their bearings, suffered from thirst and heat stroke. As a result, the army spent more energy fighting nature than fighting the Apaches themselves. But knowledge of the terrain was only half the battle. Ready to learn how the Apaches turned rocks and dust into their main weapon of invisibility? You've definitely never heard of this unique secret. The most famous and effective Apache tactic was dispersal. This technique, which they perfected, drove even the most experienced American trackers to despair. It allowed a large detachment to literally vanish before the eyes of their pursuers. It worked like this. A group of Apaches being pursued by cavalry would reach a rocky plateau or rocky foothills. In this place, where the tracks became almost invisible, the group would suddenly split up. Each warrior would go off alone in his own direction. For the cavalry, this was an impossible task. The single, easily readable trail they had been following for hours suddenly turned into dozens of barely noticeable paths, diverging in all directions. It was impossible to pursue them all, and choosing one meant almost certainly losing the main group. The soldiers described it as magic. One moment they saw a whole group of warriors in front of them, and the next moment there were only empty stones and silence. This technique was called disappearing on the stones. The secret lay in a prearranged meeting place. After splitting up, the warriors did not simply scatter in panic, but moved individually to a specific point, a distant spring, a hidden valley, or a cave. This place could be located dozens of kilometers from the point of dispersal. This tactic completely broke all the rules of classic pursuit. The army was effective against large groups, but completely helpless against dozens of elusive individuals. While the cavalrymen tried in vain to find any trace, the Apache detachment was already gathering in a safe place. This maneuver required each warrior to have the highest level of individual training. He had to navigate the terrain alone, find water and food, and move without leaving any traces. Only those who grew up in these lands were capable of this. Dispersal was also an effective way to avoid encirclement. If the Apaches realized that they were being surrounded on several sides, they simply scattered, slipping through any cordons. It was impossible to gather them again in one place.
They won't find us.
This tactic demonstrated a fundamental difference in military thinking. The army thought in terms of masses and formations, while the Apaches thought in terms of individuals united by a common goal. Their strength lay not in the unity of their formation, but in the unity of their purpose. Thus, dispersal was not simply flight, but a deliberate tactical maneuver. It turned pursuit into a senseless waste of time and energy. The Apaches did not flee from the enemy. They simply made themselves invisible. What you are about to learn will change your perception of the warriors of the Wild West. In addition to dispersal, the Apaches were masters of active disinformation. They did not simply try to hide their tracks, but deliberately created false ones to confuse and exhaust their pursuers. It was a sophisticated intellectual game in which lives were at stake. One of the simplest techniques was to move across rocky or hard ground. They could travel for miles along dry riverbeds or rocky outcrops without leaving a single footprint. Then they would reappear on soft ground in a completely unexpected place. A more complex tactic was to create a false trail. A small group of 2 or 3 warriors would separate from the main group and lead the pursuers in the wrong direction. While the cavalry pursued the decoy, the main group would retreat to a safe place. Sometimes the Apaches would imitate the trail of a large group, even though there were only a few of them. They would pass through the same place several times, creating the appearance of a large force on the move. This forced the army to gather large forces to pursue a non-existent threat. They also used their enemies' shoes. By picking up a dropped horseshoe, they could create a trail that led to a dead end or an ambush. Trackers, confident that they were following their own people, fell into the trap. Another cunning technique was to move backwards. After passing a certain section, several warriors would return along their own tracks and then make a huge leap to the side onto solid ground. This created the impression that the trail had suddenly ended. They skillfully used the natural conditions. For example, they could leave their tracks in the direction of a grazing herd, where their footprints would blend in with hundreds of others. Finding them after that was practically impossible. During night marches, they used fire to mislead their pursuers. They would build a large bonfire on one hill to attract the attention of patrols, while they themselves would slip away under cover of darkness in a completely different direction. This constant game of reality and illusion exhausted their pursuers, not so much physically as mentally. Soldiers and trackers lost confidence, began to doubt every trace, and eventually gave up the chase. The Apaches won without even engaging in battle. But even the most cunning trail is useless if the pursuers have water. In the next chapter, you will learn how the Apaches turned the main source of life in the desert into a deadly weapon. Ready to learn more? What if I told you that one of the tools of warfare was water? In the scorched desert, water was more valuable than gold. Control over water sources meant control over the entire territory. The Apaches understood this better than anyone else and used water as a powerful tool in their war. They knew the location of all the hidden springs, wells, and natural reservoirs. Many of these sources were invisible to the untrained eye and were not marked on any map. This allowed them to replenish their supplies where the cavalry was dying of thirst. In pursuit of the Apaches, cavalry units were forced to move from one known source to another. The Apaches could easily predict their route. They could ambush them at a well or simply watch the exhausted unit from a safe distance. The Apaches often used the tactic of poisoning the wells. After using a source, they would throw animal remains into it or spoil the water in some other way. The unit arriving at the site would find only murky sludge unfit for drinking. This had a devastating effect. Soldiers who dreamed of a sip of fresh water after hours of marching under the scorching sun were faced with a choice: risk their health or continue on their way in search of the next source, which they might not reach. Sometimes the Apaches did not spoil the water, but simply prevented anyone from approaching it. They took up positions on the heights around the source and opened fire on anyone who tried to get close. The soldiers, exhausted by thirst, were unable to engage in full-scale combat. The Apaches themselves had a phenomenal ability to get by with small amounts of water. They knew which plants contained moisture and were able to find water even where it seemed to be unavailable. They could put a pebble in their mouths to stimulate salivation and reduce the feeling of thirst. When the Apaches did decide to engage in battle, they chose the ideal conditions for it. One of their favorite tactics was to lie in ambush in a narrow mountain pass or canyon. This allowed a small group of warriors to inflict maximum damage on superior enemy forces. First, scouts carefully studied the route of the cavalry detachment. They identified a narrow place from which it would be difficult to retreat and where the column would be forced to stretch out. The ideal place was a canyon with steep walls or a winding mountain serpentine. The warriors took up positions in advance, positioning themselves on high ground on both sides of the trail. They used natural cover, boulders, crevices, and thickets of bushes. It was almost impossible to spot them until the attack began. They let the vanguard of the detachment deep into the trap. The attack began suddenly when the entire column was within range. The first targets were officers and standard bearers in order to cause confusion and disrupt command. A single accurate shot or a deliberately thrown rock could serve as a signal to attack. Immediately after that, a barrage of arrows and bullets rained down on the soldiers from both sides. The cavalrymen, trapped in a narrow space, were unable to turn around and organize their defense. The Apaches often blocked the escape routes. At the beginning and end of the gorge, they set up landslides, dropping huge boulders onto the trail. The detachment found itself trapped in a stone bag, completely losing its maneuverability. The main weapon in such ambushes was not so much firearms as the location itself. Panic, the echo of gunshots, bullets ricocheting off the rocks, falling stones. All this created chaos. The soldiers could not understand where the fire was coming from and where the enemy was. The goal of such an ambush was not always the complete destruction of the detachment. Often it was enough for the Apaches to sow panic, capture horses and weapons, and then disappear as suddenly as they had appeared. It was a demonstration of strength and a way to replenish their resources. Such attacks had a tremendous psychological effect. After several such ambushes, The cavalrymen began to fear every ravine and pass. Tension and fear became their constant companions, exhausting them no less than the heat and fatigue. The ambush at the pass was the quintessence of Apache tactics. It combined perfect knowledge of the terrain, patience, surprise, and the ability to inflict maximum damage with minimal force. They turned the strengths of the cavalry, its numbers and organization, into its main weaknesses. Ambushes were effective, but how did the Apaches sustain themselves during long campaigns far from home? In the next chapter, we will discuss their unique system of logistics and survival. The success of the Apache military operations would have been impossible without their unique logistics system. They had no supply trains, warehouses, or supply lines in the usual sense. Their army supplied itself, using the resources of the land it traveled through. Their diet was based on what nature provided. They were experts in edible and medicinal plants. Agave roots, cactus fruits, nuts, and seeds all became food that allowed them to survive in the harshest conditions. They were skilled hunters, but they hunted quietly without using loud shots that could give them away. Traps, snares, and silent bows were their main tools. This allowed them to obtain food without revealing their location. Each warrior carried a small supply of food with them. Usually it was something like pemmican, a mixture of dried meat, fat, and berries. This high-calorie product could sustain them for several days when there was no other food available. They obtained their weapons mainly in battle. Every successful raid on a settlement or military patrol was an opportunity to replenish their arsenal with rifles and ammunition. Thus, the American Army unwittingly became their main supplier of weapons. At the same time, they never completely abandoned their traditional weapons. Bows and arrows were silent and did not require ammunition, which could run out. The ability to wield both types of weapons made a warrior versatile. Their camps were models of mobility and stealth. They did not have bulky tents or a large amount of equipment. A light shelter made of branches and skins, a small fire in a hollow so that it could not be seen from a distance. That was all they needed. Raiding, or raids, were the basis of Apache military activity. These were not chaotic attacks, but carefully planned and lightning-fast operations. Their success depended on reconnaissance, speed, and surprise. It all started with reconnaissance. Several experienced warriors could spend weeks observing the target, whether it was a ranch, a small town, or a military convoy. They studied the daily routine, the number of guards, and the weak points in the defenses. The information was passed on to the main group, which waited in a remote and safe place. At a council, the warriors discussed the plan of attack. The best time was chosen, usually at dawn or dusk, when visibility was poor and people were relaxed.
The Apache warriors, endless, stretching as far as the eye.
The attack was always sudden. The Apaches appeared out of nowhere, attacking their target from different sides at the same time. The main task was to sow panic and prevent the defenders from organizing a coordinated resistance. Their targets were not people, but resources. They sought to capture horses, weapons, food, and other valuables. Senseless violence was not encouraged unless it was necessary to achieve the goal. Speed was the key to success. The entire operation could take only a few minutes from start to finish. They grabbed what they came for and disappeared just as quickly, without getting involved in a protracted battle. The retreat was planned as carefully as the attack. The group would leave in a predetermined direction, often splitting up to confuse their pursuers. Captured horses were driven ahead to create an additional cloud of dust and cover their tracks. The raids put enormous psychological pressure on the settlers and soldiers. No one could feel safe. The threat could come at any moment, from any direction. On paper, the American cavalry had an overwhelming advantage over the Apaches. It had more men, better weapons, artillery support, and virtually unlimited resources. However, in reality, all of this proved useless. The main problem with the cavalry was its slowness. Soldiers were overloaded with equipment, rifles, revolvers, ammunition, sabers, and provisions. Their horses also carried saddles, harnesses, and additional cargo, and needed constant rest, water, and fodder. The Apache, on the other hand, was the embodiment of lightness. He moved around with virtually no load, and his hardy horse could get by on foot fodder. As a result, Apache troops always moved faster and longer than their pursuers. The cavalry was dependent on its supply train. Long caravans of mules carrying provisions, ammunition, and water stretched for miles. Slowing down movement and presenting a vulnerable target, the Apaches could go without a supply train for weeks. The cavalry's tactics were straightforward and predictable. They were trained to fight in open terrain, in close formation. These tactics were completely ineffective in the mountains and canyons against an invisible enemy. The scouts hired by the army were often unable to unravel the Apaches' cunning traps. Even friendly Indian scouts could not always understand the logic of their movements. The pursuit often reached a dead end. Communication within the army was slow. Orders were transmitted by messengers, which took hours or even days. The Apaches, on the other hand, used a fast and effective system of smoke signals that allowed them to coordinate their actions over vast distances in real time. Soldiers arriving from the east were unprepared for the harsh desert conditions. They suffered from dehydration, heat stroke, and disease. Their heavy wool uniforms were completely unsuited to the local climate. The Apache victories were achieved not only through tactics and endurance, but also through masterful psychological warfare. They knew how to instill fear, which was no less a formidable weapon than a rifle or a knife. Their goal was to break the enemy's will to resist. Their main tool was uncertainty. Soldiers and settlers lived in constant tension, not knowing where and when the next attack would come. This fear of an invisible enemy wore down their nerves and undermined their morale. The Apaches deliberately created a reputation for themselves as elusive and omnipresent. They left signs of their presence where no one expected to see them. A lone feather stuck in the ground near a fort or a distinctive footprint at a water source all said, "We are here. We see everything." They used rumors and misinformation. Sometimes they deliberately released a prisoner so that he could tell exaggerated stories about their numbers and ferocity at the fort. These stories spread quickly, sowing panic. Sudden night attacks on posts and sentries had a huge demoralizing effect. Soldiers no longer felt safe even within the walls of the fortifications. Sleepless nights and constant tension reduced their combat effectiveness. They never gave the enemy a moment's rest. Even if an Apache detachment was too small to attack, they could disturb the cavalry camp all night long with shouts imitating animal voices or occasional shots from different directions. By morning, the exhausted and sleep-deprived detachment was incapable of effective pursuit. We can see that Apache tactics were not just a set of tricks, but a comprehensive and deeply thought-out system of warfare. It was perfectly adapted to the terrain, the mentality of the warriors, and the goals they set for themselves. They turned their weaknesses into strengths and the enemy's strengths into their main vulnerabilities. Dispersion, false trails, control of water, and use of terrain were all part of a unified strategy of asymmetric warfare. They proved that a small but mobile and intelligent enemy can successfully resist a huge military machine. Their legacy is not just a page in the history of the Wild West, but a classic textbook on guerrilla warfare. The history of the Apaches teaches us that in any conflict, it is not the one with the most resources who wins, but the one who better understands the rules of the game and knows how to impose their own. They lost their war in the long run, but their military art has gone down in history forever. Which Apache tactic do you find most ingenious and why? Was it the technique of disappearing into the rocks or the masterful use of water as a weapon? Share your opinion in the comments and don't forget to subscribe to our channel so you don't miss out on new research into the military tricks of the past.